For centuries in the foothills of the Pyrenees, in southern France and North Spain, an extraordinary secret lay hidden in plain sight. It revealed itself only when patterns in local family trees began to emerge. These families came from long lines of humble carpenters, basket makers, and rope makers, almost always relegated to the wrong parts of town. Beneath the surface was a thousand-year-old story of a cursed and unique people. They were known as the Cagos, and their history is one of relentless stigma. Despite being genetically, linguistically, and religiously indistinguishable from their neighbors, they were cast out and treated as untouchables. For nearly a millennium, the only thing setting them apart was their descent from other Cagos. Their story raises haunting questions. Who were the Cagos, and why were they condemned so completely for reasons that not even their persecutors could clearly define? To be a Cago was to live a life governed by invisible boundaries and ritualized humiliation. From birth until death, every aspect of their existence was segregated, policed by a complex system of rules designed to enforce their status as quote-unquote unclean. The physical separation began with their homes. Cagos were confined to their own ghettos, which were invariably situated on the least desirable land. These were neighborhoods outside the main village walls, often on the far side of a river or in malarial marshlands. These areas were seen as being a safe distance from the markets, taverns, and shops of the rest of the population. This physical distance was reinforced by a litany of prohibitions built on a logic of contamination. It was believed that the Cagos were pestilential, their very touch capable of poisoning the world around them. They were forbidden from walking the common roads barefoot, lest they taint the earth. They couldn't touch the parapets of bridges, drink from public fountains, or enter taverns where other people drank. To handle food or wine in the market was a crime, and they were barred from owning livestock or farming the land. In one horrific instance in the early 18th century, a Cago who dared to try to farm was punished by having his feet impaled. There are many such instances of this disturbing cruelty perpetrated on these people by their neighbors. To ensure they could be identified at a glance, Cagos were forced to wear a badge. And I need to emphasize at this point that they looked identical to the people who surrounded them in every way, though some rumors would say this was only because of their dark magic. But back to the badge. This was a piece of red or yellow cloth, cut into the shape of a goose or duck's foot, sewn conspicuously onto their clothing. This mark, which earned them the derogatory nickname canards, or ducks en français, and served as a constant visible reminder of their status. Anyone found without their badge faced fines, or the confiscation of their clothes, or potentially even worse. In some regions, the parallels with another feared group were made explicit. Cagos were required to carry a wooden rattle, or claquette, to announce their approach, the same tool used by lepers to warn others to keep their distance. This practice cemented the association with disease in the public mind, even when there was no evidence to support it. Barred from nearly all professions, especially those involving food or agriculture, the Cagos were funneled into a narrow set of trades. They became the community's woodworkers, carpenters, barrel makers, rope makers, and tellingly, coffin makers. They were the hewers of wood for the towns they lived in. This restriction created a profound irony, and Cagos became highly skilled craftsmen, particularly as carpenters. Their labor was in high demand, and they were often the ones who built the magnificent wooden roofs and doors of the very churches that would become the sites of their greatest humiliation. They were simultaneously indispensable to the community for their skills and utterly rejected by it as people, a paradox that highlights the contradictory logic of their persecution. Nowhere was the Cagos' status as inclusive outcasts more apparent than in the house of God. Their treatment in church remains their most tangible legacy, etched into the very stone of dozens of chapels. They were forbidden from using the main entrance, instead being forced through small, low side doors. These doors required them to stoop over and virtually crawl into church, where their humiliation continued. They were confined to the coldest, darkest corners of the church, separated from the main congregation by a wooden railing. The ultimate degradation came during communion. They were often forbidden from partaking at all, especially by priests who had grown up in regions with these people. When priests would pass the Eucharist to them, it was a disturbing spectacle that caused disgust to outsiders who observed it. The Eucharist was passed to them on the end of a long wooden spoon or stick, as if feeding a dangerous animal. For centuries, historians have tried to pinpoint a reason for the relentless persecution of the Cagos. The sheer variety and outlandishness of the theories reveal more about the nature of prejudice than they do about the Cagos themselves. The search for a single origin is a hunt for a rational explanation for an irrational hatred. The most common and enduring explanation was that Cagos were the descendants of medieval lepers. This theory seemed logical, as it would explain the obsession with contamination and the similarities in treatment, such as the use of rattles. However, the historical record tells a different story, and hospital records of the time in southern France indicated that they forbid entry to Cagos, whether they were sick or not. The implication of these records is that it was accepted that there were Cagos who definitely weren't sick. Another set of theories cast the Cagos as the descendants of defeated enemies, their cursed status a kind of inherited treason. One theory suggests that they were the remnants of Muslim armies from the 8th century, though no evidence supports this. For instance, the names of Cagos are identical to those of their neighbors, and they adhered to all the same traditions, showing no signs of having originally been converts. Another theory suggests they are survivors of the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathar heresy. This explanation was strategically used by the Cagos themselves in a 1514 appeal to Pope Leo X, advising that they were very orthodox in their Catholic practice. However, like the other theories on their origin, this one crumbles under scrutiny. Historical records show Cago communities existed long before the Cathar heresy and in regions where it never took hold. Where history failed to provide a reason, myth and folklore rushed in to fill the void. Fantastical stories cast the Cagos as a people cursed by God himself. They were said to be descended from the carpenters who built the cross for Christ's crucifixion, which appeared to provide an explanation for why they were so good with wood. Notably, the description of what a Cago looked like is wildly inconsistent. Some said that they exclusively had blonde hair and blue eyes and were tall, while others said they were dark and swarthy and tended to be shorter. Others said that their true appearance was much more disturbing and that they had the ability to use powerful magic to alter their appearance and fit in with the regular population. In essence, though, the purpose of these stories wasn't to describe reality as it existed, but to dehumanize a class of people. After stripping away the layers of myth, failed historical theories, and rationalizations, we are left with a stark and unsettling conclusion. There was no original sin, and the only consistent, verifiable reason a person was a Cago was because their parents were Cagos. Their persecution was a tautology. They were hated because they were Cagos, and they were Cagos because they were hated. This system was maintained not by any visible difference, but by the meticulous record-keeping of local communities, particularly parish priests, who logged every birth and baptism. A Cago who moved to a new village could be easily identified by a letter from their former priest, and thus the persecution would continue. Despite centuries of oppression, the Cagos weren't merely passive victims. As mentioned briefly, in 1514 they banded together and appealed to the Pope, an Italian, who appears to have been confused as to why they were being persecuted. Cagos only existed as a class in southern France and in Basque country under the Spanish crown, and he was likely unfamiliar with them as a class. The Pope issued a decree that Cagos were good Christians and ought not to be treated any differently either in church or in society in general. It's unclear how much impact this had on the ground at the time, since local parish priests weren't writing up reports on this class of outcasts. Further, of course, parish priests weren't supposed to be discriminating against them to begin with, so the Pope's decree was really just a restatement of canon law as it stood anyway. In France, Cagos went before regional parliaments to challenge their segregation from the rest of the populace. One famous case in Toulouse dragged on for 40 years before the court finally decreed in 1600 that the Cagos were not lepers and shouldn't be treated as such. Interestingly, this also provides one data point to indicate that after it became clear that the Pope didn't want them to be discriminated against on religious grounds, the reasons changed. They were simply treated as lepers, and as such, by the logic of the time, they needed to be kept apart, despite what the Pope said about their practice of Catholicism. The true turning point came with the French Revolution in 1789. The revolution's ideals of liberty and equality legally abolished all discriminatory laws against the Cagos, granting them, at least on paper, the full rights of citizenship. But the Cagos understood something profound about their condition. Their curse wasn't just a matter of law or social custom, it was written down in ink. Their oppression was bureaucratic, enshrined in the baptismal records and parish registers that had tracked their quote-unquote unclean lineage for centuries. During the chaos of the revolution, Cagos across the region took direct action. They stormed town halls and parish archives, seeking out the documents which proved their status and burned them. This was a targeted assault on the administrative machinery of their persecution. By destroying the official records, they were destroying the state's ability to see and enforce their hereditary status ever again. This act of liberation through erasure proved more effective than all the papal proclamations and royal decrees that had come before it. The destruction of the archives, combined with the new legal equality granted by the revolution, finally allowed the walls of the ghettos to crumble. Through the 19th and into the 20th century, the Cagos began to slowly assimilate. Intermarriage with non-Cagos became possible, and families moved away, changed their names, and shed the identity that had brought them nothing but suffering. The distinct Cago culture, forged in the crucible of persecution, simply vanished. In the end, the mystery of why these people were persecuted remains entirely unsolved. In the early 19th century, if you were standing on the northernmost shores of Siberia, you might have witnessed something baffling. Each spring, flocks of polar bears would rise into the air and fly north, directly over the frozen sea, disappearing beyond the horizon. Then, in the autumn, they would return, this time with their young. Birds can't nest on barren ice, and the evidence of life itself seemed to demand the existence of a hidden land somewhere to the north. This was a warm, fertile oasis, nestled in the heart of the polar wasteland. This natural mystery was the first clue, the first whisper of a place that would haunt the Russian imagination for over 2 centuries, a phantom island known as Sannikov Land. The story of Sannikov Land, or Zemlya Sannikova in Russian, begins with a credible witness. Yakov Sannikov was a seasoned frontiersman, ivory hunter, an explorer who knew the Arctic as well as anyone alive. He had already discovered and charted real islands, proving he could distinguish land from ice. During a cartographic expedition between 1809 and 1810, Sannikov stood on the northern coast of the New Siberian Islands and saw something new. In 1811, he reported it officially: the clear silhouette of land with high mountains, far to the north of Kotelny Island. This was a distinct geographical feature, and when combined with the inexplicable flight of the geese, Sannikov's report created a powerful, scientifically plausible hypothesis. Also, as I'm editing this now, I just realized I said polar bears instead of polar geese earlier. And you know what? I'm keeping it in. For decades, the idea simmered in the minds of Russian explorers. Then, in 1886, it found its great champion. Baron Edward von Toll was a respected Baltic German geologist in Russian service, a man of science obsessed with the Arctic's secrets. Like Sannikov before him, Toll was on an expedition to the New Siberian Islands when, on a day of perfect visibility, he saw it. From the shore of Kotelny Island, he described the sharp outline of 4 mountains. He was so convinced that he even estimated its distance and speculated as to the mineral composition of the mountains. He spent the next decade campaigning relentlessly, arguing before the Imperial Academy of Sciences that finding this land was a matter of Russian national prestige. Finally, in 1900, he got his wish, and Toll was appointed leader of the Russian polar expedition, setting sail on the schooner Zarya with a dual mission. He was to conduct broad scientific research and, for Toll, to finally set foot on Sannikov land itself. The expedition was grueling from the start, and the ship was plagued by leaks, and Toll clashed with his captain. They spent 2 punishing winters trapped in the pack ice, unable to break through to the island's supposed location. Interestingly, among the crew was a young, ambitious officer named Alexander Kolchak, who would be leading the white movement against the Reds just 2 decades later. After 2 years of frustration, Toll made a desperate gamble. In June 1902, he and 3 companions left the icebound Zarya. They would travel by kayak north to Bennett Island, a known outpost, and wait for the Zarya to pick them up when the ice finally cleared. The ship never made it as the ice was too severe, and the acting commander, following Toll's own contingency orders, was forced to sail south, leaving the 4 men stranded. The following spring, it was Kolchak, the future admiral, who led a daring rescue mission by whaleboat back to Bennett Island. He found Toll's camp, his scientific collections, and a final, heartbreaking note. Dated November 1902, it stated that the party was leaving the island and heading south by kayak, with provisions for only about 2 weeks. They were walking into the teeth of the polar night, a time of absolute darkness and treacherous, newly formed ice, and they were never seen again. The final chapter in the search came in the 1930s, when the Soviet Union, with its powerful new icebreakers and growing fleet of Arctic aircraft, decided to settle the question for good. In 1937, the icebreaker Sadko was dispatched with the explicit goal of finding Sannikov land. In a turn of profound maritime irony, the Sadko, an icebreaker, also became trapped in the ice and had to be rescued by an icebreaker. The final nail in the coffin came in 1938 when Soviet Arctic pilots flew extensive surveys over the entire region. From the air there was no hiding, and they confirmed, beyond the shadow of a cat's ass, that Sannikov land didn't exist. While this settled the historical tale of the Phantom Island, it did present a new scientific mystery in an attempt to explain what Sannikov and Toll saw. The first theory is that the island was real, but that by the 1930s, it was gone. Many islands in the New Siberian archipelago aren't solid rock, but are composed of a combination of permafrost and soil. These transient islands are incredibly vulnerable to coastal erosion, a process that is accelerating dramatically with rising Arctic temperatures. Notably, there's strong circumstantial evidence that this may be the case. The island of Mustak, in the same area, has seen extremely heavy coastline erosion at a rate of about 20 feet per year. It's entirely plausible that Sanikoff Land was one of these icy islands, and it simply melted and crumbled into the sea. The second theory is that they were tricked by the light. The Arctic is famous for powerful optical illusions called superior mirages. To an observer, this creates a shimmering, distorted image of a distant landmass appearing to float in the sky where there is only water. Many geographers today believe that what Sanikoff and Toll saw was a mirage of Bennett Island, a real island located much farther north. Notably, the scientific understanding of these mirages was limited at the time. In a weird twist of fate, despite not actually existing, or perhaps because it doesn't actually exist, Sanikoff Land became a staple of Russian and Soviet culture in the 20th century. In 1926, the Soviet geologist Vladimir Obruchev wrote the science fiction novel aptly titled Sanikoff Land. Obruchev, an expert on Siberia, gave the myth its enduring form, which continues on today, and has even morphed into a form of a conspiracy theory. Obruchev turned this non-existent island into an absolute paradise in Siberia in the Soviet popular imagination. He provided a clever scientific rationale for a warm Arctic utopia. The island was the caldera of a dormant volcano, its geothermal heat creating a lush, hidden world. He then populated it with mammoths and surviving Neanderthals. The book was wildly successful and was adapted into a movie in the 1970s. Notably, the author never claimed the work as anything but pure speculative fiction about a Siberian paradise. Despite this, some have argued that there is a real Arctic paradise in Sanikoff Land that the elites don't want anyone to know about for some reason. And trust me, there's totally nothing there, so don't go there looking for it under any circumstances whatsoever, because you definitely won't find a paradise full of mammoths.